Welcome back to Tartan Lullaby. I'm Archie, and tonight there's a long, quiet story waiting for you. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find your pillow. Soften your shoulders. Let the day go. Tartan Lullaby tells slow stories of Scotland. Real places, real years, real people, told gently enough to fall asleep inside. There's no music tonight, and no need to follow every word. If you drift off in the first few minutes, the rest will play on quietly without you. That's how it's meant to be. If these stories are a quiet corner you find yourself returning to, a subscription would mean a great deal, and it helps us keep making them. The artwork you see throughout tonight's story is available as a print in our Etsy shop, if you'd like to bring a little of Scotland onto your walls. When you're ready, close your eyes and we'll begin. Somewhere in the world, a stadium is filling up, and somewhere else, in a flat above a chip shop, in a terraced house with a garden that needs cutting, in a kitchen where the kettle is already on, someone in Scotland is getting ready to watch. Outside that kitchen window, if it is evening, the sky might be carrying the last thin wash of blue over the rooftops. A neighbor's television is a faint glow behind net curtains. The street is quiet, and the wait is almost over. This moment has been a long time coming. A generation of supporters grew up hearing about World Cups as something that happened to other countries. The wait became part of the story, and now, quietly, Scotland is back. The anticipation has a particular texture to it, not the sharp edge of anxiety, but something softer. The feeling of a door that has been closed for a long time slowly opening again, warm light spilling through the gap. But this film is not about what happens on the pitch. It is about what happens around it. It is about the people who travel, who save up, who plan for months, who arrive in foreign cities wearing kilts and carrying flags, and who somehow always manage to make friends. They are called the Tartan Army, not a name chosen by any committee or printed on any official document, but a name that found them somewhere in the 1970s and has stayed ever since. Tens of thousands of Scots have carried that name to World Cups in Argentina, in France, in Germany. They have carried it to European championships in Sweden and England, to qualifier matches in Oslo and Minsk, to tiny grounds in tiny countries where the locals had never heard a Scottish accent before. And wherever they have gone, the story tends to end the same way. The locals are surprised, not by the football, by the warmth, by the singing that sounds like a soft wall of old songs rising into a foreign evening sky. There is something in the way a Scottish supporter stands in a foreign square, tilting a cup of coffee toward the sun, entirely comfortable, entirely themselves, that seems to speak to people who have never been to Scotland and may never go. Awards have been given by FIFA, by UEFA, by local governments and tourism bodies for the behaviour of Scottish supporters. Best fans, friendliest visitors, most welcome guests. The Tartan Army has collected these acknowledgements quietly, almost bashfully, the way Scots tend to do with praise. But this reputation did not arrive from nowhere. It grew over a very long time out of something particular to Scotland, a people who have always known what it is to be far from home, who have always found it natural to sit down with strangers and share whatever they have. Perhaps it is because so many Scottish families carry the memory of emigration somewhere in them. A great-grandparent who left for Canada, a cousin who went to Australia. The idea of being a stranger in a new place is not abstract to a Scot. It is personal. To understand the Tartan Army properly, you have to go back past the 1970s, past the 1950s, past the interwar years. You have to go back to the very beginning of football itself. Because Scotland was there at the beginning. Scotland helped invent the game, helped spread it, helped give it its shape. And the supporters who followed Scotland across the world are, in their own way, the inheritors of something very old. So let us go slowly tonight. There is no hurry. Let the story settle around you like the last light fading from a Glasgow evening. We will begin at the beginning, and we will take our time. Let your breathing settle. Let the images come gently, like the turning of pages in a book that has been read before, familiar and unhurried. The night is long, and the story is patient. Somewhere in the world, a new chapter of this long story is being written. And while that chapter unfolds, this film will travel in the other direction, backwards through the decades, through ferries and trains and coaches and late-night airport floors, through the songs, the friendships, the gentle chaos, and the extraordinary warmth of the friendliest football invasion the world has ever seen. To understand where the Tartan Army came from, you have to understand what Scotland looked and felt like before the name existed. And for that, you have to go back to a very different kind of country. Let the image settle slowly. A country of stone and smoke, of grey winter mornings and brief summer evenings, of streets running in tight grids between buildings that seem to lean toward each other for warmth. In the 1860s and 1870s, Scotland was alive with industry. The Clyde was busy with ships. The coalfields of Lanarkshire were busy with men. The streets of Glasgow were dense with tenements and the smell of coal smoke and the clatter of boots on stone. The smell of that city in those years was specific. Coal and rain and bread from the bakeries, the faint sweetness of hops from the nearby breweries, the iron tang of the river when the tide was low and the mudbanks showed. These were working men and their families, living close together, working long hours, finding what pleasure they could in what time remained. And in that tight, particular world, football arrived. It arrived gently at first. A ball in a park, a stretch of grass between the terraces, young men with an hour of light left in the evening. The rules were still being invented, still being argued over, still being written down. But the game itself spread fast. The grass of those early parks was uneven, the goals no more than heaped coats or hats, the players in ordinary work clothes still carrying the dust of the day. But the pleasure was real and immediate, and word of it moved quickly through the streets. Glasgow took to it with a kind of hunger. By the early 1870s, Queen's Park Football Club, founded in 1867, had become the heart of the game in Scotland. Their players were amateurs, clerks and craftsmen, men who played for the love of it. And it was Queen's Park who would bring Scotland its first great moment of international football history. On the last day of November 1872, a crowd gathered at Hamilton Crescent, a cricket ground in Partick on the west side of Glasgow. The admission was 1 shilling. Roughly 4,000 people came through the gate. The morning of that match would have been cold, the kind of cold that settles into your collar and does not leave. The cricket ground had a wooden pavilion and a modest stand, and the bare winter trees along the boundary held their last few brown leaves. They came to watch Scotland play England. It was, by the record books of FIFA and every governing body that has looked at the matter since, the first official international football match ever played. The result was a 0-0 draw. Both sides played carefully, cautiously, feeling out a game that neither had played in quite this way before. The crowd watched with the particular intensity of people witnessing something they sensed was important. The Aberdeen Press and Journal, writing the following day, called it the best game of football ever seen in Scotland. Given the novelty of organised football at that moment, this was not a small thing to say. But think about those 4,000 people for a moment. Who were they? Men in heavy coats and caps, women wrapped against the November cold, children balanced on walls and fences for a better view. A man in his 40s who had walked from Maryhill that morning. A boy of 12 who had never seen 11 men play in formation before, watching with wide, still eyes. A woman in a dark coat who had brought her son, not knowing quite what they were walking into. They had not come in from across the country. This was a Glasgow crowd, local, walking distance. The idea of travelling to watch football had not yet formed itself in anyone's mind. That would come later. Through the 1870s and into the 1880s, the matches between Scotland and England became a fixture of the football calendar. They alternated between Glasgow and London, and slowly something new began to happen. Men started making the journey. Working men, saving their wages, arranging days away from the factory or the shipyard, boarding trains southward with a paper bag of food and a hope of something worth the telling when they returned. The railways made this possible. Without the expansion of rail across Britain in the 1850s and 1860s, the travelling supporter could not have existed. The steam train was, in a very real sense, the first piece of infrastructure for the Tartan Army. Think of those early journeys, the compartment filling with pipe smoke and conversation, the windows fogged against the cold outside, the long pull through the industrial heart of the country, through Motherwell, through Carlisle, into the flat green of England. The rhythm of the wheels on the track had a kind of lullaby to it, a steady rolling percussion that eased the journey and made the miles feel like something being gently unwound rather than consumed. These were men who had perhaps never been to London before, who found the city vast and bewildering, who stuck together in small groups for comfort, who sought out a pub and a meal and the company of other Scots before finding their way to the ground. There would have been a particular delight in hearing a familiar accent in an unfamiliar street, a hand raised in greeting, a nod of recognition between strangers who were not quite strangers because they had come from the same place and were here for the same reason. The grounds themselves were raw and simple, wooden terracing, if any at all, a rope marking the edge of the playing area, a modest pavilion for the players to change in. Football was still finding its form as a spectacle, still learning what it meant to have an audience. But the audiences were growing. By the 1890s, an average cup tie in Glasgow might draw 10,000 people. The crowd was becoming part of the experience, the murmur of thousands settling into something collective. Football in that era was not yet entirely respectable. There were those in the churches and in civic life who worried about it, who saw the crowds and the gambling and the passion as something requiring careful management. But the crowds kept coming. Because for men whose working lives were spent underground or at the forge or in the noise of the shipyard, the Saturday afternoon match was one of the few places where emotion was permitted, where you could feel something and show it, surrounded by others feeling the same. There was a warmth in those crowds that was almost domestic, shoulder pressed to shoulder on a cold terrace, breath rising in small clouds, a shared flask passed along a row, the body learning through proximity that it was not alone. Scotland's matches against England carried an additional weight. The two countries had been joined by the Act of Union since 1707, but the joining had never dissolved the sense of separateness, the distinct pride in being Scottish. On the football pitch, that pride found a clear and legal outlet. Scotland against England was not simply sport. It was identity made visible, played out in 90 minutes, with a crowd to witness it. By the turn of the century, the fixture had become one of the most eagerly awaited events in the British sporting calendar, and the small groups of Scots who had been travelling south by train had grown, not to thousands yet, but in that direction. The habit was forming. These early travellers had no name, no identity as a group, no scarves or badges marking them out. They were simply supporters, which is to say they were simply people who cared. They made the journey because the match mattered to them and because the journey itself, shared with others who also cared, was its own kind of pleasure. And when the match was over, whether Scotland had won or drawn or lost, they gathered in whatever room was available and they talked about it. The warmth of those conversations in strange cities far from home carried something forward. That is where everything begins, in the compartment of a steam train somewhere in the Scottish borders, heading south through fields going dark in the early evening. The smell of coal smoke and wet wool, the quiet comfort of company. The window holds the last faint blue of the sky above the hills. The fields below are dissolving into the dark. Someone in the compartment is humming very quietly. Someone else has closed their eyes. In that small, ordinary space, the long story of the Tartan Army was very quietly beginning. The name came into common use in the 1970s. The Tartan Army, a shorthand for the tens of thousands who would gather on the terraces at Hampden Park and who would make, twice a year or so, the long journey south to Wembley. It was a different age, a rougher, louder, less considered age in many ways, and the reputation that came with those trips was not always a gentle one. To understand what the Tartan Army would later become, you have to sit quietly for a moment with what it once was. The traveling support of that era carried something complicated with it. A fierce pride, certainly, a deep love of country and of the game, but also, by the records of the time, a habit of excess that would leave a mark. The biannual trip to Wembley was, for many Scottish supporters, the great event of the football calendar. Men would save up through the winter. They would talk about the last trip and the one before that and begin quietly planning the next one before the current season had ended. It was a ritual woven into the fabric of working-class life in Scotland's towns and cities. Picture those men in the weeks before the journey, tucking a few pounds into an envelope kept behind the clock on the mantelpiece, watching the envelope grow slowly heavier through the dark months of January and February. The match itself was almost secondary. What mattered was the going, the act of leaving, of traveling somewhere, of belonging to a moving crowd. The journey itself was an adventure. Coaches and trains from Glasgow and Edinburgh and Dundee rattling south through the night. Compartments thick with song and tobacco smoke, flasks passed between strangers who were friends by morning. There was something generous in it, something warm. And then there was also something that, in time, those same supporters would come to reflect on with a more complicated feeling. The night coaches are worth dwelling on for a moment. They left from outside railway stations and football grounds, from car parks on the edges of towns, sometimes in darkness well before midnight. A man might find himself sitting beside someone he had never met, someone from a different town, a different trade, and by the time the coach reached the border, the two of them would have talked through half their lives. Sleep came eventually in awkward angles, against cold windows, under borrowed jackets. The drinking was, by most accounts, part of the culture in a way that went beyond the social. It was woven into the whole occasion. Supporters would arrive at Wembley already many hours into the day's hospitality. The atmosphere in the stands was vivid, overwhelming, a soft wall of song that carried all the way down to the pitch. But around the edges of that warmth, there were also scenes that the records do not allow us to entirely look away from. The rivalry with England ran very deep in those years, deeper perhaps than football alone can explain. There was history in it, and something older than football, a small nation pressing its shoulder against a larger neighbor and finding, in a match, a place to say something it felt it could not say anywhere else. That intensity was not ugly in itself, but it could tip, and sometimes it did. It is worth remembering that most of the thousands who made those journeys did so in good faith. They wanted to see the match. They wanted to sing. They wanted to stand in a great stadium and feel, for 90 minutes, that their country was at the center of the world. The trouble that found its way into the records was not the whole of the story. It was a part of it, and an honest telling requires sitting with both. The afternoon of the 4th of June, 1977, is the moment that comes up most often when people speak about this era. Scotland had won at Wembley, and the supporters came over the barriers in their thousands. The goalposts were pulled from the turf. Pieces of the famous old pitch were lifted and carried away as souvenirs. The scene, depending on who is recounting it, can be told as jubilation or as something considerably less comfortable. There is honest affection in some of those tellings. Men who were there will describe the feeling of standing on that turf, under the London sky, as one of the great moments of their lives. And perhaps it was. But the records also describe the hours that followed in London's streets and stations as far less easy to look back on with pride. The joy of the match had spilled into something harder to account for, something the supporters themselves would later and gradually come to understand differently. What is striking, looking back from a distance, is how human that misunderstanding was. A crowd does not choose its worst moments in advance. Things happen in the heat of it, in the exhaustion of the journey and the long hours of anticipation. Understanding that does not excuse it, but it does place it carefully in its proper context. 1979 brought further difficult scenes, at Wembley again, with arrests and disorder and the kind of coverage that made the word Tartan Army, for a time, a phrase that carried warning notes as well as colour. It was a reputation that followed Scottish football into the new decade, a shadow beside the flag. The coach home was a quieter thing, men sleeping against windows again, but the sleep of something spent rather than something building. The lights of the motorway strobing gently past, a country scrolling by in the dark. Someone would start a song occasionally, softly, and it would trail off. No one minded the silence. And yet, to leave the story, there would be to misread it entirely, because something was already shifting, quietly, in the way supporters understood themselves and what their presence abroad could mean. The story of what came next, of how the reputation was not just repaired, but completely, remarkably transformed, is one of the more unusual stories in all of football's social history. But that belongs to a later chapter. For now, it is enough to sit with the 1970s as they were, complicated, human, and honestly told. 1978. The name alone carries something for a certain generation of Scottish people. It is said with a particular weight, a mixture of longing and laughter, and something that was once heartbreak and has, over the years, been worn smooth into something more like tenderness. Scotland had qualified for the World Cup, not for the first time and not for the last, but this time felt different. This time there was a man in charge of the national side who believed, with every visible fibre of his being, that Scotland were not just going to Argentina, they were going there to win. Ally MacLeod was the manager's name. He was warm, outgoing, a man of absolute conviction, and his conviction was, in the months leading up to June of 1978, entirely and unreservedly infectious. He spoke of the tournament not as a challenge to be met, but as a prize to be collected. He told journalists and supporters alike that Scotland had every chance of winning the whole thing. And the remarkable fact is that most of Scotland, for a time, believed him. A novelty record was made. It was called, simply, Allies Tartan Army performed by a Scottish comedian named Andy Cameron, and it sold, by the records of the time, somewhere in the region of 360,000 copies. It reached number 6 in the charts. People played it in their kitchens and their living rooms and in the coaches heading south to the record shops. It was a song of total, unembarrassed, joyful certainty, and it captured something that was genuinely in the air. In sitting rooms across central Scotland, people listened to that record and felt something lift. It was not a sophisticated feeling. It did not need to be. It was the feeling of a winter suddenly made lighter, of a question answered before it had properly been asked. Scotland was going to the World Cup. Scotland was going to win. And so the question of actually getting there, of crossing an ocean and arriving in South America, became for tens of thousands of Scottish supporters not a fantasy, but a practical matter. Savings accounts were examined. Holiday time was calculated. Letters were written to employers. Conversations happened at kitchen tables late at night, between husbands and wives, parents and grown children, friends who had been talking about going since the qualification match. One man from a town outside Motherwell is said to have counted his savings by spreading the notes across the kitchen table on a Sunday evening, every Sunday from the November before the tournament until the June it happened. He knew the total each time before he counted. He counted anyway. The ritual was part of the saving. The travel was not simple. Argentina is far from Glasgow, far from anywhere in Scotland, a journey that in 1978 required considerable planning and considerable money for ordinary working people. Supporters came by chartered aeroplane, by scheduled flight with connections in cities they had never visited, by ship crossing the Atlantic in slow, wide arcs. Some came overland in ways that defy comfortable imagining, through Central America and down through the continent by bus and by road. The aeroplane journeys deserve a moment of attention. For many of those supporters, flying was not yet an ordinary thing. It was still, in 1978, something associated with holidays they could not quite afford, with businessmen in suits and films set in other countries. And here they were, boarding a charter flight at a Scottish airport in the June morning, kilts and scarves and sandwiches in carrier bags, heading for Buenos Aires. It is difficult to overstate the strangeness of it. There are stories from that journey that still circulate decades later. Two men from a small town on the west coast of Scotland are said to have taken a route that ran through Scandinavia, then New York, then Miami, and then south through Colombia, cycling a portion of the way, wearing out several tires on unmade roads before they finally arrived in Argentina. Whether every detail of that story is precisely accurate, the records do not confirm, but it is told and retold because it feels true to the spirit of the thing. There were supporters who stepped off a connecting flight in the Caribbean and looked around in the warm island air and realized only then that they had some 5,000 miles still to cover. They had a pull-out map from a newspaper. They had come this far. They kept going. There is something almost dreamlike about those long transit hours, sitting in unfamiliar airports in the small hours, watching destinations click over on the board, waiting for a connection to a city whose name one had only ever read in an atlas. A cup of coffee from a counter where nobody spoke English. The smell of somewhere entirely new. a tartan scarf folded across a holdall on a plastic seat. When they arrived, by whatever route they had managed, the Argentinian welcome surprised many of them. By most accounts, the generosity of local people in small cities and on long roads was extraordinary. Strangers offered lifts and meals and spare rooms, and conversation conducted mostly through smiling and gestures. There were supporters who formed friendships on that trip that lasted the rest of their lives. At least one man, the stories say, met a woman in a cafe during the tournament and never came home. The Argentine winter was mild by Scottish standards. The light was different, softer and more golden, arriving at angles that felt almost theatrical after the grey of home. Supporters walked streets lined with jacaranda trees and felt the warmth on their shoulders and thought, some of them, that they had arrived somewhere that had been waiting for them. It was an irrational thought. It was also a true one. The atmosphere in the weeks before the matches had a quality that supporters who were there have spent decades trying to describe accurately. It was not merely optimism. It was a kind of collective dream, shared by thousands of people who had saved for years and traveled impossibly far and were now standing in a South American autumn, wearing tartan scarves and kilts in the pale winter sunshine, singing songs about a country they loved without reservation. Hampton Park had seen a send-off for the squad that, by most accounts, was unlike anything that had come before it. Crowds gathered to cheer the players onto their coaches. Ally MacLeod waved from the steps of the aeroplane with the ease of a man who knows exactly where he is going and what he is going to do when he arrives. The supporters who saw those images on their televisions before they left on their own journeys felt something catch in their chests. This, they thought, was the time. The matches came and went, as matches do. There were moments of brightness and moments of shadow. The tournament did not unfold the way the songs had promised. The certainty that had felt so real in the spring began, across those long June weeks, to quietly dissolve. Supporters in the stands watched and hoped and then watched some more, and the distance between what had been promised and what was happening on the pitch grew, slowly and then all at once, into something that was hard to bear. The evenings after difficult matches had a particular texture. People sitting together in cafes or on low walls outside their accommodation, not saying very much or saying the same things over and over. The Argentine night warm around them, a city going about its own life in the streets beyond. The sense that one is a long way from home, and that home is where the sadness properly lives. The record shop in Dundee that had sold those thousands of hopeful singles was, by the reports of the time, selling them for a single penny each when it was over. Customers were invited to bring a hammer and smash them on the counter if they wished. Some did. There is something both funny and unbearably sad about that detail, and it captures, perhaps better than any result or statistic, the particular texture of what 1978 felt like. But that is the football, and the football in the end was only part of what that summer was. For the ordinary supporters who had spent years saving and months planning and weeks traveling to reach that distant country, the experience had layers that the result could not touch. They had been to Argentina. They had stood in cities whose names they had once found unpronounceable. They had been welcomed by strangers. They had been part of something enormous. The stories they brought home were told for decades. around dinner tables and in pubs, and to children and grandchildren who had not yet been born when it all happened. The details shifted in the telling, grew warmer and stranger and more luminous with the passing of years. A submarine somewhere, a record sold for a penny, a woman in a cafe in Cordoba, a cycling map torn by mountain roads. And there was the flight home. Long hours in a seat, the Atlantic somewhere below in darkness, the mind moving slowly between the things that had happened and the ordinary world waiting at the other end. Somewhere over the ocean, a man might close his eyes and see, behind them, the pale gold light of an Argentine afternoon, the green of the pitch, the colors of the scarves. It was over. It had been real. What endured was not the disappointment, though the disappointment was real. What endured was the fact of having gone. The going was the thing. The going and the coming home with something that no result could take away. The memory of a summer when an entire nation had, briefly and beautifully, believed with all its heart that anything was possible. By the early 1980s, following Scotland abroad had become something more than a weekend away. It had become a rhythm, a way of measuring out the years. Supporters who had done it once found themselves pulled back, drawn not only by the football, but by the particular feeling of being part of something that had no name yet. The journey was half the point. In those years before budget airlines remade the world, getting to a tournament meant ferries and overnight trains, shared compartments, strangers becoming friends over paper cups of something warm, and the long dark miles rolling past the window. There was a specific pleasure to the overnight train that is difficult to explain to those who have never taken one. The compartment filling with strangers who would, by morning, feel like people you had known for years. The rhythm of the wheels, the way conversation drifted and quietened as the miles accumulated and the night deepened outside the glass. From ports along the west coast of Scotland, supporters would board ferries heading south and east, their bags stuffed with kit, their pockets lighter than they would have liked. The Irish Sea and the North Sea were crossed in the early hours, and there was a particular quality to that crossing, the grey water and the grey sky and the distant lights of a shore that was not home. On those ferry decks in the dark, before the bar closed and the seats in the lounges filled with sleeping figures, there was time to stand at the rail and watch the water. The ship's lights cast a pale trail on the surface. The wind was cold. Somewhere ahead was a continent that felt enormous, full of roads not yet traveled. Below decks, the lounges filled gradually. People arranged themselves in the reclining seats with the practiced efficiency of those who had done this before. Jackets became blankets. Bags became pillows. The engines settled into their low, steady note, and the ferry found its rhythm on the water, and one by one, the travelers let the crossing carry them towards sleep. By most accounts, the 1982 World Cup in Spain was the first time large numbers of Scottish supporters made the journey together in a way that felt truly organized. A traveling community rather than a collection of individuals all heading the same direction. Spain in summer was a country of heat and late evenings and food served at hours that made no sense to visitors accustomed to colder latitudes. The light at 10 o'clock in the evening was still golden, still warm, the streets still full of unhurried people going nowhere in particular. The supporters from Scotland moved through it all a little dazed, a little delighted. Then came Mexico in 1986. A very long way indeed. Supporters who could afford the flights found themselves in a country that felt utterly different, in heat that was nothing like Glasgow in June, among colours and sounds that were unlike anything they had known. Scotland were placed in a group with West Germany, and the journey to reach those matches took hours and great patience. There is something about traveling far for something you love that changes a person, or perhaps reveals them. The supporters who came back from Mexico carried stories they would tell for the rest of their lives, not always about the football, but about the road, the waits, the small disasters that became, with time, the best parts of the story. Italy in 1990 brought the support to a country that seemed designed to be loved. Warm evenings, beautiful old cities, food that bore no resemblance to what most of the travelling fans had eaten at home. Scotland were based in Genoa for their group games, and the city absorbed the visitors with what felt like easy grace. Genoa is a city built on hills and history, its streets narrow and its light particular, falling in shafts between tall old buildings in a way that makes the ordinary feel ancient. The supporters walked those streets in the early mornings before the heat built, and the city was quiet then, and beautiful, and felt like somewhere they were glad to have reached. The supporters spread into the narrow streets around the old port, into cafes and squares, and the Italians watched them with something between curiosity and warmth. There were kilts among the marble and the ancient stone, and the records suggest the locals found it more amusing than alarming. Scotland played Brazil in Turin, and many supporters made that additional journey. Across the breadth of a country they were still getting to know by train and by borrowed lifts, and by methods that, looking back, required a great deal of optimism about European rail timetables. The train between Italian cities in summer is a particular experience. The carriages warm, the countryside extraordinary, vineyards and old hill towns, and the pale blue distances of a country that seems, to northern eyes, almost impossibly beautiful. Supporters sat with their bags on their laps and watched it pass and said very little, which is its own kind of contentment. The campsite culture that had developed around these tournaments was its own world. Supporters who could not afford hotels found patches of ground on the outskirts of host cities, and there they created temporary villages, Scotland in miniature, with their own routines and their own social order, flags strung between tent poles, the smell of something cooking on a small stove at 7 in the morning. Those campsites at dawn had a quality that was all their own. The light coming in low and golden across the canvas, the dew on the grass, the sounds of a campsite stirring slowly to life. Someone boiling water, someone searching a bag for a clean shirt, the birds in the trees above entirely indifferent to the tournament happening in the city beyond. Sweden in 1992 was the European Championship, and it was the first time Scotland had qualified for that tournament. The significance of that was not lost on the supporters who made the journey north. across the water to a country that in those years felt clean and quiet and very far from anything they knew. The crossing to Sweden by ferry from ports in the south of England or across from Denmark had its own character. The Baltic was calmer than the North Sea, a different shade of blue, the light softer. Supporters stood at the railings and watched the Swedish coastline appear, low and green and unhurried, and felt the particular anticipation of a country not yet known. Swedish summers are long and soft and light. The sun barely sets in June, and there is a particular dreamlike quality to evenings when the sky stays pale and golden until midnight. Supporters found themselves sitting outside late into what should have been the night, the air warm, the sky refusing to darken. The Swedish supporters and the Scottish supporters took to each other with great ease. There was a shared sensibility there, a certain dry humour, a taste for sitting with a drink and not saying too much. The records suggest both sets of fans found each other quietly delightful. Somewhere in a Swedish town in the summer of 1992, in the long amber light of an evening that never properly darkened, two sets of supporters sat together at outdoor tables and found they had very little to argue about and quite a lot to agree on. That, too, is part of the story. The shared quiet of strangers who have discovered, unexpectedly, that they are not so different. By the mid-90s, following Scotland had become a way of life for a certain kind of supporter. They had their roots and their rituals. They knew which ferry crossings were bearable and which were not. They knew that the overnight train from London was better than it sounded, that the compartments were small, but the sleeping was possible if you arranged yourself carefully. They knew the small tricks of the road, which station had the best food at 3 in the morning, which border crossing was likely to be slow and which waved you through. They had learned, over many journeys, that patience was not something you performed on these trips, but something you actually developed slowly as the miles and the years accumulated. France in 1998 was the peak of an era. A full World Cup on the doorstep, almost. The ferry from Dover to Calais, the familiar European motorways, the vineyards, and the flat northern plains, giving way slowly to the variety of French geography as you went south. The north of France from a car window is a country of wide skies and orderly fields and small towns with church towers rising above the rooftops. In summer the light is long and the roads are quiet in the early mornings, the mist still sitting in the low ground beside the rivers, the wheat golden on either side of the road, and a World Cup waiting somewhere ahead. The support that arrived in France that summer was larger than any that had made the journey before. Tens of thousands. They came by every means available: ferries, trains, coaches, cars loaded with too much luggage and not enough maps. They came with flags that had been to Italy and Sweden and Mexico, faded now and well-traveled. St. Denis for the opening game. Scotland played Brazil, the very first match of the tournament, in a stadium that was then still new and enormous. The evening was warm. The support was there in great numbers, a soft wall of colour in the stands, and there was the feeling that whatever happened on the pitch, the journey had already been worth it. At the border crossings, which in those years before the continent opened fully could still take an hour or more, supporters waited with the patience of people who had grown accustomed to waiting. The guards would work their way along the queue. Passports were examined. Bags were sometimes opened, and there would be a moment of mild theatre as the contents, flags and scarves and football shirts, and not much else, were inspected and waved through. Sleep came easily on those long journeys, if you let it. The train rocking gently in the dark, the compartment warm, the voices of fellow travelers quietening one by one, someone's head finding the window, someone's jacket folded into a pillow, the miles unreeling outside and the night passing and the destination getting closer in a way that needed no attention, only rest. For many supporters, the journey was the thing. The road through France, the towns passed through, the meals taken in places whose names they had not known before and would remember always. A particular square in a particular city, a campsite outside Bordeaux where someone had a guitar, a ferry crossing home at the end of it all, the sea quiet and the sky pale, the tournament over and already becoming memory. There is a moment in the history of the Tartan Army that is hard to fix precisely but easy to feel. A point at which the character of the traveling support shifted, not overnight and not at anyone's instruction, but deliberately, collectively, by choice. In the years before that shift, Scottish supporters had not always been the people they would later become. The 1970s had its difficult moments. There were incidents, confrontations, the kind of behavior that left marks in newspapers and in the memories of those who witnessed it. It was not the whole story, but it was part of the story. Then, in the early 1980s, something changed direction. In England, football violence was worsening, filling the news and the courts and the minds of a generation of supporters who were trying to decide what kind of people they wanted to be when they were watching football abroad. The Scottish supporters made a choice, quietly, without a manifesto, without a committee. Individual by individual and group by group, the character of the traveling support began to renegotiate itself. The decision, the records suggest, was partly about pride and partly about contrast. If England's supporters were becoming a problem for the world, Scotland's would become the opposite. If aggression was one way of being seen, good humour was another. And good humour, it turned out, was a thing that travelled rather well, crossing languages and borders with very little difficulty at all. It began with small things, a decision not to push where pushing was not needed, a choice to meet hostility with a joke rather than a shove, a habit of introducing yourself to the supporters of the opposing team before the match rather than after. These were not dramatic gestures. They were shifts in the grain of ordinary behavior. There was something in the act of crossing a border, of arriving as a guest in someone else's country, that clarified this instinct. You were a visitor. You were representing somewhere. The streets you walked in were not yours. How you behaved in them said something about the place you had come from, and the traveling supporters, over the years, came to feel that responsibility rather than resent it. In the years when border formalities still existed, before the continent opened and the crossings became invisible lines on a motorway, There was a moment at each frontier that concentrated the mind. The brief pause, the uniform at the window, the question about where you were going, and then the stamp and the wave through and a new country unfolding around you. It was a small ritual, but it carried weight. The kilts helped. There is something about a kilt in a foreign city that opens conversations. It is specific enough to be curious and friendly enough not to threaten. Supporters who wore them found that strangers wanted to talk, wanted to touch the fabric, wanted to know where they had come from. It was an invitation to the kind of encounter that made traveling worthwhile. A man in a kilt asking for directions in a European city is a small event that tends to go well for everyone. The person being asked is pleased to help. The person asking is grateful. A few words are exchanged, perhaps more than strictly necessary. A connection is made and then released, as connections made while traveling are. Both parties carry the small warmth of it a little further down the road. Self-policing was the mechanism, and it became, over time, a genuine culture. If one supporter was becoming difficult, another would step in quietly, not aggressively, not with confrontation, but with a hand on the shoulder and a suggestion that they sit down and have something to eat. The support policed itself because the support had decided that its reputation was worth protecting. By the time Scotland reached Italy in 1990, the culture was beginning to show. Researchers who studied those supporters at the tournament wrote about what they called the carnivalesque, a festive, self-conscious performance of friendliness that was also, at the same time, entirely genuine. The supporters were performing good behavior because they believed in it, not merely because they had decided to perform it. In Genoa and Turin, and the cities that held the group games, the interaction between the Tartan Army and the Italians became part of the tournament's texture. Supporters helped with directions. They learned a handful of words in Italian. They bought rounds for local men in bars who did not understand why these people were being so friendly, but were not entirely unhappy about it. There were encounters with supporters from other countries that became their own small stories. A Brazilian supporter whose hat had blown away and was retrieved by a Scotsman in full kilt, running after it into a fountain. A group of Irish supporters and a group of Scottish supporters sharing a campsite and discovering, with some surprise, that they had exactly the same opinions about almost everything. There was a particular kind of kindness that emerged in these encounters. A local shopkeeper who stayed open a little later because the visitors were still wandering. A family who invited a small group of supporters in off the street for something to eat and would not hear of payment. A taxi driver who refused the fare and instead drove the long way so his passengers could see more of his city. These things were small. They accumulated into something large. The campsites were, in many ways, the soul of this culture. In those temporary communities on the edges of European cities, the usual distances between strangers collapsed. You shared a water tap. You asked to borrow something. You offered something in return. The ordinary mechanics of camping created the conditions for the kind of easy sociability that the Tartan Army became known for. France in 1998 was the moment the wider world noticed. The tournament was enormous, the largest sporting event the country had ever hosted, and journalists had come from everywhere to cover it. And what the journalists kept writing about, alongside the football, was the Scottish supporters. They wrote about the handshakes and the good cheer, the willingness to sit in a square for 4 hours talking to whoever happened to be sitting nearby, the absence of anything that looked like menace. At the end of the tournament, the records suggest, journalists covering the competition voted the Tartan Army the best supporters of the whole World Cup. The International Association for Nonviolence in Sport gave their recognition to Scotland's fans for their conduct in France. The Euro 92 supporters in Sweden had already received something similar, named the best supporters of that tournament too. Two major competitions in 6 years. A reputation that had been built by thousands of individual decisions in bars and campsites and squares and matchday streets was now recognized far beyond the traveling community itself. But the recognition, though pleasing, was not really the point. The point was what it felt like from the inside. A traveling community that had chosen, consciously and collectively, to be a certain kind of people when they were away from home. Generous, funny, warm towards strangers, patient with the complications of foreign bureaucracy, unlikely to make any situation worse. The charity work wove itself into the culture naturally. Supporters began collecting for local causes in host countries, learning the name of a children's hospital, turning up with donations that no one had asked for. It was not organized from above. It emerged from the same impulse that drove the self-policing, a desire to leave places better than they found them. Word would pass through the community the way word passes through any close community, quietly, without announcement. Someone had heard of a local cause that needed support. A collection would be organized in a square or outside a stadium. Donations gathered in a hat or a plastic bag. Then a small group would go, a little awkwardly, a little proud, to hand the money over. These were not grand gestures. No one organized a press conference. No one took photographs for a newspaper. The money changed hands, the thanks were given and received, and the group walked back into the ordinary afternoon. That was, perhaps, what made it matter. It was done because it was the right thing and for no other reason. There is something quietly remarkable about a large group of people deciding, without being told, to be better than they have been. Most of the time, groups move in the other direction, each individual behavior excused by the behavior of others. The Tartan Army moved the other way, each individual behavior raising the floor for everyone else. The shared experience of travel had something to do with it. People who have spent 20 hours on a night ferry and an overnight train to watch a football match have already demonstrated something about themselves. They have decided that the thing is worth the inconvenience, that patience and effort are not too high a price. That kind of person tends to extend the same generosity to the world around them. There is a tiredness that comes from long journeys that is not unpleasant. It softens the edges. It makes the ordinary remarkable. A chair, a warm drink, a view of an unfamiliar street in the early evening. The traveling supporters knew this tiredness well, and they moved through their tournaments wrapped in it, a little blurred, a little open to the world in a way that ordinary life at home did not always allow. By the end of the 1990s, the identity was settled. Not perfect, not without its complications, but settled. The Tartan Army was the traveling support that other traveling supports were compared to. It was the warm standard. The friendly strangers arriving in your city with flags and kilts and a willingness to have a conversation with absolutely anyone. And underneath all of it, underneath the awards and the recognition and the reputation, was something simpler. A community of people who loved their team and had decided that loving their team meant being good to the world their team played in. Who had learned, over ferries and overnight trains and long roads through unfamiliar countries, that the journey was the thing, and the people you met along the way were the thing, and that all of it, the travel and the friendship and the small kindnesses offered and returned, was the point. In the summer of 1998, Scotland came to France. They came with kilts and saltires, with songs and an easy warmth that the people of Paris seemed to find quite disarming. The city was not ready for them, and then, very quickly, it was charmed by them. Paris in that June was dressed in the last warmth of early summer. The horse-chestnut trees along the boulevards held their canopies still. The cafe awnings were down against the afternoon heat, and the chairs faced the street, as they always do in Paris, so that everyone might watch the world pass. Into this scene arrived thousands of supporters in blue and tartan, and the world, for a little while, was watching them. The Tartan Army had travelled to tournaments before. They had a whole philosophy built around going, around the journey itself mattering as much as anything that happened on the pitch. But France felt different. France felt like a homecoming of sorts, a grand stage for a country that had always believed it belonged on one. Paris in June. The boulevards were warm and the light fell long and golden across the stone. Thousands of supporters in tartan and blue found the cafe terraces, the parks, the bridges over the Seine. They posed for photographs with bemused locals. They bought rounds for strangers. The records suggest the goodwill was genuine on both sides. Along the quays of the Seine, supporters sat with their feet dangling above the river, sharing bread and wine with people they had met that morning. The water carried the last of the evening light downstream toward the sea. Someone was playing an accordion somewhere further along the bank. No one moved to find out where. It was enough to let the music arrive on its own terms. The match itself was the opening fixture of the entire tournament, played on the 10th of June. Scotland faced the holders, the reigning champions, a team of extraordinary talent. By most accounts, the atmosphere before kick-off was one of the more remarkable sporting scenes that year, a soft wall of blue and gold inside a great new stadium, something enormous and gentle gathering in the summer air. Scotland went a goal behind early, as many had expected. Then, against most expectations, they were level. The crowd's warmth seemed to rise for a moment, something hopeful lifting briefly before the second half settled things. The holders won, as holders so often do, but Scotland had not been embarrassed, and the supporters outside made clear they were not ashamed. After the match, the supporters spread back through the city. Some walked for an hour simply to feel Paris under their feet. The metro was warm and crowded, and nobody seemed to mind. Street vendors sold cold drinks at the street corners, and the night was short because June nights in Paris always are, the sky not fully dark until nearly midnight, a deep blue rather than black. There were two more group games to come. The campaign ended, as Scotland's often did, without the progress to the next round. But the supporters moved through those final days in France as though the result were almost beside the point. They were there. France was beautiful. The summer was warm and long. In the evenings after the final group game, supporters gathered on terraces that spilled onto cobblestones. Someone would start a song and others would find the melody gently, the way people do when they are tired and content and not trying to impress anyone. The candles on the tables burned low. The waiter brought more wine without being asked. The night settled over Paris like a hand laid softly on a shoulder. What nobody said aloud in those last gentle evenings of June was that this would be the last time, not for a few years, for a generation, for what turned out to be the better part of 30 years. No one said it because no one knew. Scotland had qualified for the previous 7 World Cups in a row. The idea that this one might be the last for decades simply did not form. They carried France home with them without knowing they were doing so. A ticket stub in a jacket pocket. A cafe receipt with someone's handwriting on the back. A photograph of the bridge, the river, the late evening light. These things would sit in drawers and shoeboxes for years, and then for decades, and they would come to mean something quite different from what they meant in the moment. The supporters flew home, or took the ferry, or drove south through France with the windows down, scarves on the back seats, a tournament behind them. They had no reason to feel anything but tired and glad. The heartbreak, if that is the right word for something so quiet and slow, was still ahead of them. The years after France were ordinary at first. Scotland missed the 2000 World Cup in South Korea and Japan. That was disappointing, yes, but disappointment was not unusual. Scotland had missed tournaments before. They would qualify again. They always had. The supporters packed away the France '98 scarves and waited. There was a new campaign, then another. There were bright starts and poor finishes, good results in the autumn, and collapsed hopes the following spring. The pattern had a rhythm to it, almost a familiarity. In some households, the France '98 shirt was washed and folded and placed somewhere careful, not in the wardrobe with the ordinary things, somewhere more deliberate, a shelf, a box, the back of a drawer. It would be worn again for the next tournament, whenever that came. That was the understanding. The shirt waited, unhurried, not knowing it might wait a very long time. In the autumn of 2003 came Amsterdam. Scotland had won the first leg of the Euro 2004 playoff at home, a slim and precious lead carried north across the sea. The return leg in the Netherlands became one of the more painful evenings in Scottish football memory. By most accounts, it was thorough and final. The players came home, and the supporters came home, and the qualification door swung closed again. The city of Amsterdam in autumn is all bare trees along the canals and light that arrives at a low angle and turns everything amber. Supporters who made the journey carried that light home with them too, folded inside a disappointment that was already becoming familiar. They found the old cafes, they found the familiar songs, they found the conversation that always follows a result like that, measured and rueful, and not without warmth. Those who had been in Paris in '98 were now a few years older. Some of them had been to tournaments in the '90s before France. Some of them had been to tournaments in the '70s and '80s. They had a long habit of traveling, and habit is a powerful thing. They kept booking flights. The campaigns became a kind of liturgy. The group draw in the autumn, the opening home win perhaps, the difficult away match, the dropped points, the late mathematics, the calculators coming out in October, the frail hope that other results might cooperate, and then the final reckoning, the long winter without a tournament to look forward to. Scotland came close to qualifying for the 2006 World Cup, close enough to feel it, not close enough to reach it. The 2008 European Championship passed without them. The 2010 World Cup in South Africa went on without them. By then, a decade had passed since France, and still they had not been back. The city of Tbilisi appears in the records from around this time. Georgia was not a fashionable footballing nation, and Scotland, by most accounts, should have managed the campaign better than they did. A defeat in Tbilisi in 2007 cost them dearly. Another set of flights came home half empty of hope. Tbilisi sits in a valley ringed by mountains. Supporters who went there remember the scale of the landscape more than the match itself, the way the hills held the city in something like a cupped hand. The stadium was modest, and the evening was cold for October, and the journey home was very long. That coldness on the terraces becomes part of the texture of those years. Cold away ends in cities that football rarely visits, the faithful few keeping the songs going anyway. The supporters who made those trips built a kind of community in the not qualifying. They had tournaments they could not attend, but they gathered anyway in living rooms and pubs to watch other countries do what Scotland kept failing to do. There was something in that too, a loyalty that did not depend on reward. The 2012 European Championship came and went. The 2014 World Cup in Brazil came and went. The city of Belgrade appears more than once in the records from those years, in group matches and qualifiers where something was always riding on the result, and the result was always harder to secure than it looked on paper. Belgrade in autumn has a particular character, wide streets and old buildings, and a river that moves slowly through the city. Supporters arrived from Glasgow and Edinburgh and Aberdeen with the usual mixture of optimism and self-awareness. The night after the match, whatever the result, they found bars and shared the evening with locals who were curious about these quiet, persistent travelers from the north. By this point, some supporters had been following Scotland without a major tournament for 15 years. Some of them had children who had never seen Scotland at a World Cup. The children asked what it was like in France in '98. The parents tried to describe it. Paris in June, the stone buildings and the warm evenings and the improbable feeling of being welcomed somewhere grand. A father might describe the Seine at dusk, the way the light came off the water. He might try to explain the feeling of arriving in a great city and finding it had made room for you. The child listening would not quite understand, not yet, but they would remember the tone of it. They would come back to that tone years later when they had their own journeys to recall. The qualification campaigns had their own small dramas. There were wins against significant opposition that gave brief, genuine hope. There were individual players who carried the weight of a nation's longing with grace and commitment. The Tartan Army sang for all of them, home and away, in grounds both large and modest. Warsaw appears in the records from these years as well, another European city where Scottish supporters arrived in numbers, another night where the result did not go as needed. The precise circumstances vary by account, but the emotional pattern was the same. The early hope, the effort, the slow deflation, the long journey home. Warsaw in autumn is all fallen leaves and wide squares and the sound of trams in the quiet. Supporters who made the journey describe the city kindly, as they always describe the cities, because for the Tartan Army, the destination has rarely been the problem. The night before the match, they found good food and easy company. The match itself was harder. The morning after was quiet, and the train back to the airport moved slowly through the suburbs. What is remarkable, looking back at these years from a distance, is not the failures. Qualification campaigns fail for many reasons, none of them shameful. What is remarkable is the continuity of the supporters. The same people, year after year, new people joining them, younger fans who had chosen to adopt the habit of traveling even when there was nothing at the end of it. The Tartan Army had a reputation, well established by this point, for being genuinely pleasant guests in other countries. They were known for it. In grounds and city squares across Europe, in small towns, in qualifying groups few people outside football would recognize, the supporters arrived with an infectious ease. They seemed, by most accounts, to understand something about the point of it all that pure results could not measure. The 2016 European Championship was the first to expand its field. Scotland did not qualify. The 2018 World Cup in Russia came and went. 20 years now since France. A whole generation of supporters had reached adulthood knowing only the absence. The shirts that had been folded away carefully were never worn. Some of them stayed in their boxes, a little faded now. Children who had grown up asking about Paris now had their own reasons to ask when Scotland might return. The question passed from generation to generation like a folded letter, the handwriting slightly different each time, but the words the same. In 2020, delayed by a year and played eventually in 2021, the European Championship finally brought Scotland back. The playoff format had been changed, and Scotland came through it, holding on through long and difficult evenings that included a night in Belgrade requiring every nerve. The drought ended, quietly, after 23 years. But the playoff years, the long middle passage between France and that return, deserve their own tender accounting. Those supporters who traveled through the wilderness decades were not naive. They knew the odds. They went anyway. They wore the tartan. They sang softly in the cold away ends of cities that barely noticed them. There is something worth keeping in the telling of this story about what loyalty looks like when it is not rewarded. It does not look like bitterness. It does not look like regret. It looks, in most accounts of those years, like a group of people who simply decided that being there mattered more than the scoreline, and who turned up faithfully for nearly 3 decades, on the small chance that this time it might be different. Let that settle for a moment as you rest. 23 years of autumn group draws and winter calculators and cold away ends. 23 years of packing a scarf and booking a flight. The faith required for that is not a small thing. It is the kind of faith that asks nothing back and keeps going regardless. Close your eyes on that image. A figure in tartan in a half-empty stand somewhere in Europe, singing quietly to no one in particular. And perhaps that is its own kind of victory, not on the pitch, not in the record books, but in the quiet, personal ledger of loyalty kept by thousands of ordinary people who loved a football team and chose to keep loving it through all the long years, all the way from Paris to wherever the road eventually led. In the summer of 2024, the tournament of European football came to Germany, and with it came something that no one quite expected, something that outlasted the results, outlasted the group stage, outlasted the scorelines that fans quietly knew might not go their way. What came was warmth, in quantities that surprised even the most seasoned observers of the game. Scotland had qualified. That alone was worth celebrating. For a generation of supporters who had known long stretches away from major tournaments, simply being there in a warm German summer, in a country famous for precision and order, was something close to a gift. The journey itself was part of it. Trains crossing the Alps in early morning light, the windows silvered with dew, motorways cutting through pine forests in the east of Germany, the sky wide and pale, campervans parked in quiet fields outside old market towns, salt flags strung from the wing mirrors like bunting. Every road, it seemed, was leading somewhere worth going. By most accounts, somewhere in the region of 200,000 Scots made their way to Germany across those weeks of football. They came by plane and by train, by car and on foot, filling hotels and campsites, spilling into beer gardens and cathedral squares with their flags and their songs, and their particular brand of cheerful, generous company. Munich saw them first. The great Marienplatz, the ancient heart of Bavaria, became for a few days something altogether Scottish. Saltire flags hung from windows and lampposts. Kilts moved through the baroque archways of the old town. Café tables filled with people sharing food and stories, and the particular warmth of a crowd that had traveled very far to be somewhere together. The Marienplatz has stood at the center of Munich for 9 centuries. Traders, pilgrims, emperors, and musicians have all passed through it. On those particular evenings of 2024, it held something new, a warm sea of song in blue and white, rising gently over the old gabled buildings and settling into the warm evening air like something permanent. The Bavarian summer did its part. Long evenings settled slowly over the city. The light turned golden over the church spires and the market stalls. And in the beer gardens, which are themselves a kind of German institution, a way of sitting together under trees and letting the evening pass gently, there were Scots who seemed to understand this perfectly, who settled in as if they had always been there. Beer gardens in Bavaria are old places, some of them centuries old, built under chestnut trees whose canopies were planted deliberately to keep the ice beneath the ground cool in summer. There is something unhurried about them. Long benches, shared tables, the sound of conversation rather than noise. The visiting Scots seem to find in them a rhythm they already knew, the rhythm of people choosing to be together. There are stories, well documented now, of Scottish supporters in Munich drinking one particular brewery entirely dry, a cheerful first in 200 years of that establishment's history. The brewery's staff, by several accounts, were delighted. The fans paid their bills, said their thank yous, and moved on to find more hospitality elsewhere. From Munich, the wave of color and song moved through Germany. Cologne, with its great Gothic cathedral rising above the Rhine, became another gathering place. The cathedral steps, one of the most photographed spots in Europe, became briefly a stage for pipes and singing, and the gentle, theatrical performance that the Tartan Army has always given the world. The Rhine at Cologne is wide and steady, and at dusk it catches the light from the cathedral's stone in long, broken reflections. To stand on the riverbank on one of those evenings was to see the city at its most beautiful. The twin spires rising into a sky the color of old amber, and below them, among the old streets and the bridges, the blue and white of a traveling crowd finding its place in a very old city. The mayor of Cologne, Henriette Ricoeur, was among those who spoke publicly about the Scottish visitors. She praised their warmth, their behavior, their contribution to the city's atmosphere during tournament time. The Cologne project leader for Euro 2024, Sven Stolz, described what the Scottish fans brought to the city as amazing and perfect, words that stuck in the record of that summer. Stuttgart, too, was filled with blue and white. A city of hills and green valleys in the south of Germany, Stuttgart had its squares and its streets transformed by the traveling support. Fans explored, found their way into local life, joined festivals that were already happening, and brought their own festival with them wherever they arrived. Stuttgart sits in a wide valley ringed by vineyards and forested hills, and in the summer the light there has a particular quality, soft and greenish, as if filtered through leaves. Supporters climbed those hills and looked down on a city that was, for a few weeks, theirs as much as anyone's. The view from above at dusk was of a city comfortable with being celebrated. Observers noted something particular about the way these supporters moved through Germany. They were curious as much as celebratory. They asked after local customs and local food. They sat next to people who did not support Scotland and made them feel welcome anyway. They treated every city they passed through as somewhere worth knowing, not merely as a backdrop to their own journey. In the smaller squares away from the main tournament venues, in the beer gardens that were not the obvious gathering places, this curiosity was most visible. Supporters who had wandered off the well-worn path found themselves at a local bakery at 7 in the morning, or in a hardware shop whose owner spoke no English, and navigated those encounters with the particular cheerfulness that seems to travel with them wherever they go. And then there was the tidying. This detail became one of the small, telling stories of the tournament. After long evenings in public squares and open spaces, Scottish supporters were seen in the early morning light, gathering their own litter, stacking it neatly, leaving the squares cleaner than they had found them. In some accounts, they helped clear areas that had nothing to do with them at all. Those early mornings had their own particular quality. The city still cool, the light barely pink above the rooftops, the pigeons returning to their usual corners. And among the first people on the cobblestones were figures in tartan and blue, bending quietly to lift what the evening had left behind. A square that had held thousands of people restored, patiently, to something like its ordinary self. This is not a grand gesture. It is a quiet one. It is the kind of thing that passes without announcement. But it speaks to something in the character of these gatherings, a sense that you are a guest in someone else's city, that the place existed before you arrived and will exist long after you leave, and that it deserves your respect. Scotland did not advance from the group stage. This is settled history now, and it carries no shadow over what followed, because what followed was something rarer than a quarter-final. What followed was a genuine outpouring of affection from an entire host nation for a set of visiting supporters who had given everything except victories. German newspapers wrote about them. German television carried footage of them, not fighting, not causing trouble, simply being present in the most generous way possible, filling the spaces of German city life with color and song and the particular pleasure of a crowd that wants everyone around it to have a good time. The phrase used in one well-read German publication captured something true: "Please never leave." It was said with a degree of humor, as these things often are, but it carried a sincerity beneath it. The Scots had arrived in very large numbers and had made Germany feel, for those few weeks, like a warmer and more musical place. There were German families who kept the small things: a saltire sticker placed with permission on a garden gate, a postcard left on a cafe table, a few words of Scots spoken into a phone and played back, laughing, to a grandmother who could not travel but wanted to know what it sounded like. The small residue of warmth settling into ordinary life. There is a tradition in the Tartan Army that goes back many decades. The idea is simple. Wherever Scotland plays, the supporters bring the best of themselves. Not only their passion for the team, which is real and has sometimes survived very trying circumstances, but their humor, their hospitality, their willingness to meet the world on its own terms. That tradition reached something close to its fullest expression in Germany in 2024. The tournament, taken as a whole, produced its various narratives. There were other stories, other drama, other moments of joy and disappointment. But one story persisted through all of it, growing broader as the weeks passed. It was the story of the Scottish supporters. FIFA's Organisation for Supporters of the Game and several independent observers of tournament football had in earlier years noted the particular quality of the Tartan Army as supporters. That summer in Germany added another chapter to a long record. It was not a chapter about winning. It was a chapter about something that, in the long memory of football, may matter more. How do you measure the value of 100,000 people making strangers feel welcome in their own country? How do you account for the pleasure given, the friendships begun across language and culture, the mornings spent clearing squares, the evenings of shared song that meant nothing to league tables and everything to the people who were there? You measure it in the way Germany spoke about those weeks afterwards. You measure it in the testimonies of locals who shook hands with visitors they had never met and would likely never see again. You measure it in the simple fact that long after the results were recorded, what people remembered about Scotland at Euro 2024 was not the scorelines. What they remembered was the people, the warmth of them, the noise of them, the gentle hospitality of them in someone else's country, a warm sea of song moving through Munich in the evening light, saltires over the Rhine, kilts among the old stones of Stuttgart. These images settled into something more lasting than a tournament. They became part of the ongoing story of who the Tartan Army is and what it means to follow a national team not only with hope, but with generosity. The chestnut trees in the beer gardens are still there. The cobblestones of the Marienplatz still catch the afternoon light in the same way they always have. The Rhine still moves steadily past the cathedral steps, but somewhere in the texture of those places, invisible and persistent, something from that summer remains. And as the summer faded and the trains took those 200,000 home, Germany was left with something it had not quite expected. The memory of a visit that had been, in all the ways that matter most, entirely and quietly magnificent. There is a part of the Tartan Army story that does not live in the records of tournaments or the statistics of qualification campaigns. It lives instead in the quieter places, in small schools and children's wards, in community centers and rehabilitation rooms, in the modest and lasting work of people who ask themselves a simple question. The question was this: if we are visiting these places, these countries and cities that welcome us as guests, why should we not leave something good behind? The answer to that question became a charity, and the charity began, as many of the most enduring things begin, with a friendship and a particular moment of human need. It was 1999, and Scotland had a match in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Bosnian War had ended only a few years earlier. The country was in the long, slow process of rebuilding. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office had discouraged travel. Most people would not have gone. But some did. A number of Scottish supporters made the journey to Sarajevo, drawn by loyalty to their team and perhaps by something else, a curiosity about a country and a people who had been through something very hard and were finding their way back. Sarajevo in those years was a city of contrasts, its old bazaar and Ottoman fountains intact, and around them the marks of years that no city should have to carry. The supporters who walked its streets saw all of it. They asked questions. They listened. The visit to that city shaped some of them in ways that a match result never could. In Sarajevo, they met a man. The records know him as Mirza, a medical student who had worked as a translator during the years of conflict. He befriended the visitors. He showed them the city, the streets that were still learning what peace felt like. A friendship was made across very different lives. A little time passed. Mirza wrote to his new friends with a story. There was a boy called Kemal. Kemal had been 3 months old in 1992 when the shelling of Sarajevo took his mother and in the same terrible moment, part of his leg. He had grown up, as children do, finding ways to live with what had happened. But now he needed a prosthetic limb, and the means to pay for it were not there. Among those who heard this story was a man called Ali Mac Ivor, a civil engineer from Aberdeen. He wondered what might be done, and what followed was the particular alchemy of the Tartan army at its best. Word spread, people gave, and before long enough money had been raised to help Kemal with something to spare. That remainder, the money left over once Kemal's need was met, became a question in itself. What should it do? The conversation moved onto the Tartan Army message board, that busy corner of the internet where supporters had long gathered to discuss matches and travel and everything else. The answer that emerged was characteristic of the community. Give it to a cause in the next country Scotland visits. The next game was in Lithuania in 2003. A donation was made. A small presentation took place. Something that had begun as a response to one boy's need became a practice, and then became a principle, and then became a registered Scottish charity, the Tartan Army Sunshine Appeal. The principle is straightforward and beautiful in its simplicity. Wherever Scotland plays, wherever the supporters travel, a donation will be made to a children's charity or a good cause in that country. Not a large donation by the measures of major philanthropy. The records suggest amounts in the range of £1,000 to £5,000, collected from the supporters themselves, passed on with care and a personal presentation by members of the traveling group. What matters is not the scale. What matters is the practice, the accumulation of small acts of generosity across a journey that has now lasted more than 2 decades. Picture a community hall somewhere in Eastern Europe on a grey Tuesday afternoon. A few people have gathered, none of them expecting much. A small delegation of football supporters arrives, carrying something modest, expressed with genuine care. The handshake across the threshold, the moment of translation, the photograph taken not for newspapers, but for the community hall's own wall. This is how it happens. By the spring of 2026, the Sunshine Appeal had made more than 110 donations in 23 years, without interruption. 110 times, supporters of a national football team had arrived in a country, identified a need, collected money among themselves, and left something behind. 110 quiet acts of grace spread across the map of the world. In the Baltic states, where winters are long and school budgets are careful, donations have gone toward books and heating and the small equipment that makes a classroom feel cared for. Children sitting at desks that are a little steadier, in rooms that are a little warmer, because a group of football supporters passed through on their way to a game. The causes have varied as widely as the countries. Schools in Eastern Europe, where resources are thin and children sit in classrooms waiting for things most children take for granted. Children's hospitals in countries where the wards are full and the budgets are not. Community groups in South America and Africa trying to build something lasting in places where football itself has long been the language of hope. In the children's hospitals, the donations have sometimes gone toward things that sound small. A particular piece of equipment, replacement mattresses for a ward, a garden where children who are well enough can sit in the sun. These are not small things to the children who use them. They are the texture of recovery, the small dignities that make a difficult time bearable. There have been donations in the familiar football nations of Western Europe and in countries that rarely see a visiting football crowd at all. The reach of the appeal follows Scotland's qualification calendar, which means it sometimes goes to places the wider world barely notices, and it is precisely in those places that a gesture of this kind can mean the most. In some of the countries where Scotland has played less often, the arrival of the delegation was perhaps the first time anyone from a foreign football crowd had come to their community with anything other than a flag and a song. The gesture landed differently there, harder and more lasting. The people who run the Sunshine Appeal are not professional fundraisers. They are football supporters. They have day jobs and families and the ordinary complications of ordinary lives. What they have in addition is the habit of asking, in every new city and every new country, who needs something here and what can we give? The logistics of it are more complicated than they look. Identifying a cause requires research and local knowledge. Making the donation requires paperwork and translation and the navigation of different legal and financial systems across dozens of countries. Doing this more than 100 times without interruption is a quiet achievement of organization as much as generosity. There is a phrase that recurs in the way supporters describe the appeal's philosophy. The idea that the countries visited are not merely stages for a football occasion, but places with their own life and their own need, places that have opened their doors to a foreign crowd and deserve something in return. A kind of manners expressed in the gentlest possible form. For the children who have benefited from the appeal over the years, the connection to Scottish football may be abstract or non-existent. What they know is that something arrived, something useful and kind, from people who had no particular obligation to give it. The world is full of reasons not to give. The Sunshine Appeal has spent more than 2 decades finding reasons to give anyway. Think of the countries visited over 23 years, the range of climates and languages and currencies, the different shapes of need, the different ways of receiving a gift, and across all of it, the same delegation quietly going about the same work, finding the place, making the presentation, saying goodbye. When Scotland arrived in Germany for Euro 2024, the Sunshine Appeal travelled with the supporters as it always does. The larger story of that tournament was the warmth between the Scottish visitors and their German hosts. But quietly, as it always has, the appeal looked for its small place to do its work. It is perhaps the most complete expression of what the Tartan Army has become over these decades. Not merely a crowd that follows a team, but a community that has decided, collectively and without fanfare, that turning up is not quite enough. That being a guest in the world carries responsibilities as well as pleasures. There is nothing glamorous about this. No one gets a trophy. No match is won or lost. The donations do not trend on the internet, and they do not feature on the back pages of newspapers. They happen in the margins of football calendars, in school assembly halls and hospital meeting rooms and community centers, with handshakes and careful words and the particular warmth of strangers doing something kind. And yet the moments are real. A school that has new equipment, a ward that is a little quieter and a little more comfortable, a community group that knows, from that afternoon forward, that people it will never meet again wished it well. These realities exist in the world because a charity exists, and the charity exists because a civil engineer from Aberdeen asked what might be done. But they accumulate. Over 23 years, they accumulate into something that changes the shape of the story. The Tartan Army is known for its color, for its songs, for its humor and its fellowship. It is known now, too, for this, for having found a way to make the journey mean something beyond the game. And so the story of the world's friendliest football supporters is not only written in the beer gardens of Munich or the cathedral squares of Cologne. It is written, too, in the quieter places, in the schools where the heating now works, in the wards where children recovered a little more comfortably, in the small, steady accumulation of 110 moments of grace. Wherever Scotland goes next, the appeal will travel with them. And somewhere, in a country that may not know much about Scottish football or the particular warmth of a summer crowd, something good will arrive. Left behind, gently, by people who believed that the best way to visit the world is to leave it a little brighter than you found it. Every journey begins the same way. A suitcase packed with a kilt, a scarf, perhaps a flat cap, a passport stamped with optimism. And somewhere on a distant continent, a local who has never quite encountered anything like the travelling supporters of Scotland and who is about to be disarmed entirely. The Tartan Army has touched down in places where the very idea of Scotland is a romantic abstraction. A green island on old maps, a place of mountains and mist, and something vaguely epic. And then the fans arrive in person, wearing tartan in 37-degree heat, grinning at everything, and the abstraction becomes something warm and real. In South America, the welcome has always carried a particular warmth. The story goes that it was Scottish engineers and railway workers travelling south in the 19th century who first pressed a football into the hands of the people they found there. The game took root, grew, became something enormous. And so when Scotland supporters arrived in those cities generations later, there was a sense of recognition, almost of reunion. In Argentina, where the football religion runs deepest, this sense of reunion had an almost ancestral quality. Supporters would sometimes meet local people who carried Scottish surnames, descendants of those same engineers and merchants, men and women who knew a few words of a language they had never visited and felt a pull toward a country they had only ever seen on a map. The conversations that followed were unhurried and quietly extraordinary. By most accounts, the locals in those South American cities had difficulty believing what they were seeing. Men in kilts ordering local beer with elaborate and unsuccessful attempts at the language. Groups of supporters stopping to admire street food with the genuine, unhurried curiosity of people who have nowhere urgent to be. Every photo opportunity accepted. Every handshake returned. In Brazil, the warmth of the welcome was matched only by the confusion the kilts produced. Street musicians paused their sessions to watch. Market traders beckoned supporters over to examine the tartan as though it were a rare textile requiring study. Children ran alongside groups of fans for an entire city block, simply to see what would happen next. What happened next was always good-natured and gentle. The Tartan Army Sunshine Appeal was born from exactly this spirit. Since 2003, the supporters' charity has aimed to make a donation in every country where Scotland play. Hospitals, children's projects, local causes. The fans arrive, they celebrate, they give something back, and they leave a place that is, in some small way, a little better than it was before. In Asia, the tartan drew particular attention. The records suggest that in Japan, where Scottish supporters made the journey in the 1990s, locals would line streets simply to look at the kilts. Children reached out to touch the fabric. Shopkeepers emerged from doorways. There was something almost theatrical about it, though entirely unintentional. Japan had its own long and quiet affection for Scottish culture, woven through its appreciation for whiskey, for tweed, for certain kinds of understated craft. When the supporters arrived with their warmth and their willingness to sit down and talk, the reception was notably tender. In one account, a group of fans ended an evening in a small Tokyo bar singing traditional songs with the bar's owner, who had learned the melodies from records he kept behind the counter. What struck people in those encounters was not the costumes but the mood. The supporters were not performing. They were genuinely happy to be there, genuinely curious, genuinely open. They posed for photographs with the same willingness, whether the request came from a journalist or a 7-year-old who had never seen a kilt in her life. In South Korea, the story was similar. Supporters who arrived for qualifying matches found themselves welcomed into families' homes, fed dishes they could not name, shown photographs of ancestors who had worked alongside Scottish missionaries in the early years of the previous century. The football brought them there. Something older and less definable kept them at the table. Across Africa, the reaction followed a similar pattern. Scottish supporters would arrive at modest grounds, at local bars with televisions balanced on shelves, and find themselves adopted almost immediately. The singing would begin. Someone would teach a local a verse of something. Someone else would attempt to explain the offside rule and fail entirely. By the end of the evening, there would be toasts in languages nobody on either side fully understood. In countries along the western coast of Africa, where the game has deep roots and is followed with an intensity that needs no translation, the Tartan Army found audiences who understood the emotional register immediately. The devotion, the hope, the willingness to travel enormous distances for 90 minutes of football, these were things that required no explanation. The language of following a team is universal. The kilts just made it more memorable. There is a recurring quality to these stories wherever they are set. The Tartan Army supporter, slightly sunburned, possibly lost, invariably cheerful, asking for directions and ending up at a family dinner, offering to help carry something and staying for 3 hours, turning a brief encounter into something neither party will entirely forget. North America has its own chapter of this story. The Scottish diaspora there is substantial and old, threaded through the history of cities from Boston to Vancouver. When Scotland supporters arrive in those places, they sometimes find great-grandchildren of emigrants who left the Highlands and the Lowlands a century ago, people who have kept the names and some of the songs and a deep, quiet attachment to a country they have never quite left. Those reunions have a tenderness to them. The traveling fan and the diaspora descendant meeting in a bar somewhere in New England or the Pacific Northwest, piecing together a shared history from fragments, a family name, a place on a map, a melody half remembered. The football is almost beside the point. In cities like Chicago and Toronto, where Scottish cultural societies have kept the pipes playing and the reels turning for generations, the arrival of the Tartan Army was received as something close to a homecoming. For the diaspora, it was the homeland arriving on their doorstep. For the traveling supporters, it was the homeland reflected back at them from unexpected angles, a little altered by the decades, but recognizably itself. The Belgian Olympic Committee gave the Tartan Army a fair play prize after a qualifier in Brussels. The mayor of Zagreb praised them after a match in Croatia. At the 1998 World Cup in France, a tournament Scotland did not survive in the footballing sense, the supporters were described by more than one reporter as one of the genuine highlights of the whole competition. That is an unusual thing to be said of the supporters of a team that did not advance. It suggests that the football was, in a sense, the frame, and that the real picture was something else. The color and the warmth and the willingness to connect. The songs offered as gifts rather than weapons. The laughter that crossed every language barrier without difficulty. Perhaps the most honest summary came not from any official award, but from an ordinary exchange in an ordinary city, the kind that happens dozens of times on every trip and is never written down. A local, watching the visitors with a mixture of curiosity and delight, turns to a friend and says something to the effect of, "I did not know what to expect, but it was not this. It was much better than this." There is something in that reaction which speaks to what the Tartan Army actually is, beneath the kilts and the noise. It is a traveling community of people who have decided, collectively and without any formal agreement, that their role in the world is to be a good thing, to arrive, to be warm, to give where they can, to leave something that lasts. The Tartan Army, moving through the world, leaving these small bright marks. A donation here, a photograph there, a friendship that nobody quite planned. The story of how a small nation became known in football grounds and local markets and harbour bars on every continent as the friendliest invasion the world had ever seen. There are gaps in stories, and then there are silences. Scotland's absence from the great tournaments of world football was the second kind, long enough to become part of the landscape, long enough that younger fans had grown up knowing it as simply the way things were, Scotland as a team that watched from the outside, that qualified for the qualifier of the qualifying round, and then came home early. 1998. Paris in June. Scotland played, sang, celebrated the tournament itself, and did not progress from the group stage. The flights home were already booked. The fans packed their kilts and their stories and returned to Glasgow and Edinburgh and Inverness, carrying something bittersweet, the way you carry a holiday that ended too soon. What nobody quite knew on those homeward flights was how long the wait would be. 10 years felt possible. 15 years felt unlikely. 25 years was a number that would have produced silence at any table, in any bar, anywhere in Scotland. Some of those supporters sat on the planes home and told themselves it would be 4 years, or 8 at most. They told their children the same thing. They spoke in the way people speak when the alternative is too large to look at directly. The wait ahead of them was a closed room, and they were not yet ready to open the door. The years that followed were not without their moments. There were qualifying campaigns that caught fire, draws that felt like victories, victories that felt like signs. There were managers who arrived with ideas and optimism and left with apologies. There were players who gave everything and teams that came agonizingly close, and then, in the cold light of the final table, did not come close enough. Each near miss left its own particular bruise. A defeat in a playoff on a wet November night. A draw that ended a run. A penalty that went the wrong way. These were the milestones of the long absence, each one remembered with the precision that human memory reserves for disappointment, each one filed away in the shared archive of what it means to follow Scotland. The fans travelled anyway. That is the thing that deserves to be said clearly. Through the qualifying rounds, through the playoff defeats and the near misses and the long silences, the Tartan Army kept showing up. Smaller contingents, sometimes, but still present, still singing. The habit of following Scotland had been built into so many lives that even the absence of a major tournament could not entirely extinguish it. For many supporters, the absences became their own kind of story. Fathers who had been to Argentina in '78, to Spain in '82, to Mexico in '86, watching from living rooms as the years passed. Sons and daughters who had heard the old tales of those trips and grown up half hoping, half disbelieving. Grandchildren who arrived in a world where Scotland at a World Cup was something from before they were born. The shirts were still there, folded in drawers, brought out for the home qualifiers. The scarves still hung in hallways. In some homes, the ritual of watching the draw, of setting up for a qualifying campaign with something that looked almost like certainty, was passed from generation to generation the way other families pass down recipes or prayers. There is a particular quality to long-deferred hope. It does not die easily. If anything, it deepens. Each near miss adds another layer to the feeling, the sense that when it finally comes, the release will be proportionate to the wait. Scottish supporters understood this because they had no choice but to understand it. The waiting had been so long it had become its own kind of loyalty. There were supporters who had been to every home qualifier for 20 years without once reaching the tournament at the end, who had stood in the same sections of Hampton and Murrayfield and Celtic Park, the same faces growing older together, the same half-superstitious rituals observed before each match. They had made a community out of the waiting, which is perhaps the most Scottish thing of all. The turn began quietly, as turns often do. A run of results that looked, for once, like a pattern rather than a coincidence. Young players coming through with a composure and a quality that previous generations had not always been able to sustain. A manager who seemed to understand the weight of the shirt and could transmit that understanding without crushing the freedom that good football requires. Qualifying campaigns began to look different, not necessarily easier, because qualification from a European group has never been easy for any nation, but different in spirit. There was a solidity, a sense that leads would be protected and deficits could be overturned. Fans who had learned to brace themselves began, tentatively, to allow themselves something else. Scotland reached the European Championship in 2020, a tournament delayed and refashioned by circumstances beyond anyone's control. After 23 years away from that competition, the team was back. The scenes at Hampden Park when qualification was confirmed were by all accounts extraordinary. People who had not cried at a football result in years found themselves undone. The 23-year wait gave the moment a weight that ordinary victories cannot carry. Supporters who attended the qualification match remembered noticing the person next to them. An elderly woman standing perfectly still, her scarf pressed to her mouth, her eyes closed. A young man who had driven through the night from somewhere far north and stood in disbelief as the mathematics resolved. Two strangers who turned to each other because there was no one else and held on for a moment before the moment passed. And then the European Championship of 2024 qualified with games to spare, a record start to the campaign. A team that carried the tartan onto a new stage and gave the travelling supporters something they had been rationing for decades. The genuine expectation of being there, of walking through a European city in tournament colours, of belonging to the story. But these, for all their joy, were the European stage. The World Cup was the original dream, the oldest and deepest longing. 1998 France the last time. The gap between then and the next qualification grew wider each year. At 20 years it felt remarkable. At 25 it felt like something that demanded a name. At nearly 30 years it had become a defining fact about modern Scottish football, an absence so long it had almost become identity. Those who had been to France in '98 were, by now, in their 50s, their 60s, or beyond. They had carried the memory of that last World Cup, the way people carry the memory of something precious they are not sure they will see again. Every qualifying campaign had been an attempt to reach back toward that feeling, and every failure had pushed it a little further away. There is a kind of supporter who does not speak much about hope, who has been disappointed enough times that hope feels like a vulnerability rather than a pleasure, who watches the opening matches of a qualifier with a certain deliberate blankness, saving the feeling for later, not entirely sure later will come. Scottish football had produced many such supporters, careful, experienced, armoured. And then the results began to arrive, and one by one the armour was quietly set down. The stories of individual supporters in those years are the ones that stay with you. The father who bought a Scotland shirt for his newborn and kept it, unworn, against the day. The group of friends who had made a standing arrangement every 4 years to travel together to whichever city the draw sent Scotland to, an arrangement that sat dormant for more than a quarter of a century. The phone chain maintained, the enthusiasm sustained by sheer stubbornness. There were mothers who had watched their own fathers follow the national team and had followed it themselves all their lives, who had quietly decided they would keep following it for as long as their legs would carry them. There were supporters in their 80s who had not missed a home qualifier in 30 years and had no intention of missing one now, even when the season was cold and the bus to the stadium ran only once an hour. There were supporters who travelled to away qualifiers in their 70s and 80s in cold November stadiums in distant cities, because to stay at home would have felt like giving something up, something they had decided years ago not to give up. The football was the vehicle. What they were really travelling toward was the feeling they had last had in France in 1998, and the belief, never entirely extinguished, that it was still out there somewhere. When the qualification finally came, in a late autumn match at Hampton, the records suggest that the crowd understood before the final whistle that something enormous was about to happen. The mathematics had been building for weeks. The noise that rose from the stadium was described by those who were there as unlike anything they had heard at a football match, because it was not quite the noise of a victory. It was more like the noise of a release. 28 years of waiting, turning in an instant to something bright and physical and real. Grown men, by their own admission, wept. Reporters who had been covering Scottish football for decades reached for words and found them inadequate. The chairman of the supporters' charitable organization said simply that he had waited 28 years for this. That sentence, in its plainness, contained everything. The wait had been so long it had a number, a specific weight, an arithmetic of longing. In towns and villages across Scotland that night, people who had not watched a football match in years sat in front of televisions and felt something stir in them. Neighbours appeared at doors. Pubs that had been empty filled without any signal being given. The qualification belonged to everyone, not just those who had been to every qualifier, but to everyone who had ever cared, which was almost everyone. A billboard appeared in the centre of Glasgow in the days after qualification was confirmed. 2 words, simple as a telegram: "We're in." For a certain generation of supporters, those 2 words contain the entire history of the long absence. The missed tournaments, the close calls, the loyalty maintained through disappointment, the belief passed between parents and children and grandchildren like a quiet inheritance. What the return represented was not simply a return to a football competition. It was a restoration of a particular kind of belonging, the feeling of being part of the great shared story of a World Cup, of traveling towards something that the whole world was watching, carrying the colors and the songs of a small nation, arriving in a distant city and saying, simply and honestly, "We are here. We were always coming. It just took a little longer than we hoped." The Tartan Army began to make its plans. The kilts were taken from wardrobes. The passports were checked. The old conversations resumed, the ones that had been paused for 28 years. Where are you going? What route are you taking? Have you found somewhere to stay? The machinery of following Scotland, kept in careful order through all the years of absence, was turning again. Somewhere in that preparation was a feeling that defied easy description. Not quite excitement, because excitement suggests something uncomplicated. Not quite relief, though relief was part of it. It was more like the moment when a held breath is finally released. A long, slow easing of something that had been held in place by effort and stubbornness and love. Whatever lay ahead, the waiting was over. The chapter that had been left open in France in 1998 was about to resume. The fans who had carried the hope through the long gap stood at the edge of something new, something they had earned through decades of loyalty, and looked toward it with the particular emotion of people who have wanted something for so long that its arrival feels almost impossible to entirely believe. And so it begins again, the planes lifting into the grey sky over Scotland, carrying their cargo of tartan and hope and good humour. The ferries easing out of harbour in the early morning, with the mist still soft on the water. The songs beginning, quietly at first, as they always do. From the very beginning, this story was never quite what it appeared to be. The world looked at the travelling supporters of Scotland and saw football fans, which they were, but football was the river, not the source. The source was something older and simpler, a small nation's need to reach out, to connect, to say, "We are here and we are glad to meet you." Every city the Tartan Army has visited carries a small deposit of that feeling. A bartender in Buenos Aires who still remembers a conversation from 20 years ago. A family in Seville who kept the photograph. A street vendor in a Japanese city who still, apparently, finds it funny that a man in a kilt asked him for directions in entirely the wrong direction. The charitable donations in 20-odd countries. The fair play prizes and the civic tributes. The mayors and tournament officials reaching for the right words to describe supporters who somehow managed to be present and warm and generous while remaining consistently the most welcome guests in the room. It is a remarkable thing, when you think about it, to earn a reputation not for winning, but for how you travel, not for what your team achieves, but for the warmth you carry with you and leave behind. The Tartan Army built something that no trophy cabinet can hold, a record of human decency stretched across 4 decades and 5 continents. The story was always, underneath everything, a love story. A small, cold, beautiful country, fiercely proud and quietly tender, sending its people out into the world with the only things they could reliably bring: good company, a sense of humour, an absolute willingness to sing, and the kind of warmth that needs no translation. Somewhere tonight, the planes are still in the air. The kilts are still folded in the overhead lockers. The songs are half remembered, half invented, rising in the darkness over the Atlantic. And in 100 cities, people who have met the Tartan Army before are telling the stories, and people who have never met them are about to. Let the world receive them gently. Let the friendships form. Let the songs rise softly into evenings that are warm and unhurried and full of small bright moments that will be carried home and kept. And let Scotland, the small country on the northern edge of things, know that its greatest export was never whiskey or textiles or engineering, though it was all of those. It was this: the willingness to show up to reach out, to make something warm in an unexpected place. The journey fades now into something softer, a long road behind, and somewhere ahead a city glowing gently in the summer evening. The voices have grown quiet, the flags rest, everything settles. Rest now, the journeys are made, the songs are sung. Somewhere far away, a kilt is folded carefully and set beside a bed in a quiet room. Outside, the city breathes, and Scotland, as it always has, carries on. Let the long wait be the last thing you hold, and then let even that go. 28 years dissolving into nothing but a feeling of warmth. The stories told, the distances crossed, the hands shaken in 100 different languages. All of it drifting gently now, like mist off the morning lock. Sleep well, the tartan is folded, the passport is closed, the world is kind tonight. That's where we'll leave it for tonight. The story is finished, but the night isn't, so let this play on as long as it helps. If Tartan Lullaby has been good company, you're welcome to subscribe so the next story finds you. There's no rush. If you'd like to see the landscapes that go with these stories, the art prints are at Tartan Lullaby Art on Etsy, with mood boards and stills on Pinterest under the same name. The links are in the description below. Until next time, thank you for listening. Sleep well, all is well.